July 4th, 1961, North Atlantic. 300 feet beneath the waves, a Soviet nuclear submarine is dying. Inside its steel hull, 87 men are trapped with a reactor that is melting down. The temperature in the reactor compartment is climbing past 100 degrees Celsius. Radiation levels are spiking beyond the limits of any measuring device. And just miles away, an American destroyer is listening, waiting. This is not a movie. This is the real story of K-19. And the question that has haunted historians for decades. When the Soviet Union's most secret weapon was at its weakest, why didn't the United States strike? The answer begins long before that fateful day. To understand why K-19 became a ticking time bomb, we must go back to the heart of the Cold War. The late 1950s. The Soviet Union is locked in a desperate race with the United States, not just for territory, but for technological supremacy. And in this race, the ocean is the new frontier. Nuclear submarines are the ultimate prize. They can hide beneath the waves for months. They can carry nuclear missiles that can strike any city on Earth. They are the perfect weapon for a world living under the shadow of mutual assured destruction. K-19 was not just another submarine. It was a symbol. The first Soviet ballistic missile submarine capable of launching nuclear-tipped missiles while submerged. Project 658. NATO called it the Hotel Class, but to its crew it was simply Hiroshima, a nickname earned before it even sailed. Workers at the Sevmash shipyard whispered it after a series of accidents during construction. A fire that killed several welders, a radiation leak during reactor testing, bad omens. But in the Soviet Union of 1959, omens did not matter. Only deadlines mattered. And the deadline was political. Premier Nikita Khrushchev needed a demonstration of Soviet naval power. He needed a submarine that could match the American George Washington class, which had already gone on patrol with Polaris missiles. So K-19 was rushed. Corners were cut. Safety protocols were overlooked. The submarine was commissioned on November 12, 1959. But it was not ready. Not even close. The crew was assembled with the same haste. Captain Nikolai Vladimirovich Zateyev was a seasoned officer, but he had never commanded a nuclear submarine. Many of his men were young, eager, but poorly trained for the complexities of a nuclear reactor at sea. They were patriots. They believed in the mission, but they were not prepared for what awaited them in the deep, cold waters of the North Atlantic. The mission of July 1961 was part of a larger exercise called Polar Star. The goal was to simulate a nuclear strike on the United States. K-19, along with 2 other submarines, was to sail to a position off the coast of Greenland, launch its missiles in a coordinated salvo, and disappear back into the Arctic. It was a show of force. A message to Washington. We can reach you anytime. But the exercise was plagued with problems from the start. During initial sea trials, K-19 suffered a complete loss of electrical power. The reactor shut down. The submarine drifted, helpless, for nearly an hour before emergency systems kicked in. It was a warning, but warnings were ignored. The political pressure was too great. The exercise had to proceed. On July 3rd, K-19 reached its designated patrol area. The crew was exhausted. The submarine was vibrating with unusual noises. The reactor, a VMA pressurized water design, was behaving erratically. Temperature fluctuations, pressure drops. The engineers reported their concerns to Captain Zateyev. But the order from Moscow was clear. Maintain position. Prepare for missile launch simulation. So they held their course. And then, at 4:15 on July 4th, the unthinkable happened. A loud bang echoed through the hull. The reactor compartment alarm screamed. cooling loop for the starboard reactor had ruptured. Coolant, a mixture of water and boric acid, was spraying into the compartment. The reactor core, no longer properly cooled, began to overheat. Rapidly, the temperature gauge climbed past 800 degrees Celsius. The fuel rods were beginning to melt. If the core melted completely, it could trigger a steam explosion. Or worse, a nuclear detonation. Not a full-scale atomic bomb, but a catastrophic release of radiation that could contaminate the entire submarine and poison a vast area of the North Atlantic. For the crew, it was a choice between two hells: stay and face radiation poisoning, or abandon ship and risk the reactor exploding, potentially triggering a war. Captain Zatayev faced an impossible decision. Standard procedure called for immediate surfacing and evacuation, but they were in international waters, near a U.S. Navy task force. Surfacing could mean capture, or worse, it could be seen as an act of aggression. The submarine was carrying live nuclear missiles. If the Americans boarded it, they could seize the technology. The secrets. The entire strategic balance could shift. Zatayev made his choice. They would stay submerged. They would try to repair the reactor. And they would do it with the tools they had, which were almost nothing. The repair plan was desperate. The damaged cooling loop could not be fixed from outside the reactor compartment. Someone had to go inside, into the heart of the radiation. The compartment was already registering levels lethal within minutes, but there was no other option. Zatayev called for volunteers. 8 men stepped forward. They were given no special protective gear, just simple rubber suits and makeshift masks. They were told the truth. The chance of survival was slim. But if they failed, all 87 would die. And the mission would fail. What happened next is a blur of horror and heroism. The 8 men entered the reactor compartment. The air was thick with steam and the metallic smell of radiation. Their Geiger counters clicked so fast they became a continuous shriek. They worked in shifts of no more than 2 minutes at a time. Any longer, and the radiation dose would be instantly fatal. Their task was to weld a new cooling line, but the welding equipment was not designed for such conditions. The heat from the reactor made the metal too hot to touch. The steam obscured their vision. One by one, the men began to collapse, vomiting, bleeding, their skin blistering. But they kept working, passing tools, holding lights, encouraging each other. For 3 hours they fought the melting core, and slowly, miraculously, they succeeded. The new cooling line was installed. The reactor temperature began to drop. The immediate crisis was over, but the cost was staggering. All 8 men received lethal doses of radiation. They were carried out of the compartment unconscious. Over the following days and weeks, they would die in agony, their bodies ravaged by acute radiation sickness. But their sacrifice saved the submarine, and perhaps the world. Now, let us return to the question that frames this story. Where were the Americans? We know that U.S. Navy listening posts detected unusual acoustic signals from K-19 that night. The destroyer USS Gearing was in the vicinity. It picked up the sounds of the explosion, the frantic activity aboard the Soviet sub. American intelligence knew something was wrong, very wrong. Satellite imagery later showed K-19 surfacing erratically, emitting unusual heat signatures. The U.S. had a golden opportunity. A crippled Soviet nuclear submarine, adrift, with a crew dying from radiation. They could have intercepted it, boarded it, seized the missiles, the reactor technology, the code books. The intelligence windfall would have been incalculable. So why didn't they? The answer lies in the delicate, terrifying calculus of the Cold War. First, there was the risk of escalation. In 1961, the world was still reeling from the U-2 incident. The Berlin Wall was being built. Trust was non-existent. If an American destroyer had approached a Soviet submarine in distress, the Soviets might have interpreted it as an attack. K-19 still had its nuclear missiles. Even damaged, it could have fired. Or the Soviet command, believing the US was launching a first strike, could have ordered a full-scale retaliation. The risk of triggering a nuclear war over one submarine was simply too great. Second, there was the matter of precedent and international law. Even in the depths of the Cold War, there were unwritten rules. A vessel in distress, regardless of nationality, was to be offered assistance. To exploit a disaster for intelligence gain would have been seen as a profound violation of maritime norms. It could have damaged America's moral standing with its allies. And in the court of world opinion, that mattered. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the United States may have already known what it needed to know. By 1961, American intelligence had a fairly accurate picture of Soviet submarine technology. The K-19 was a first-generation design. Its secrets were already becoming obsolete. The US was more interested in the newer, quieter submarines that were under development. Letting K-19 limp home, with its crew traumatized and its reactor damaged, may have been seen as a better outcome than creating a martyr incident that could galvanize the Soviet military. But there is another, more human possibility. Perhaps in that moment, the American officers on the USS Gearing made a conscious choice. They heard the sounds of suffering from the Soviet sub. They understood the horror unfolding beneath the waves. And they chose, for once, not to act as adversaries, but as fellow sailors. There are unconfirmed reports that the U.S. Navy transmitted a coded message on an international distress frequency, offering assistance. The message was never acknowledged by K-19, but it was sent, and it was recorded. Whether it was an act of compassion or a calculated probe, we may never know, but it adds a layer of profound ambiguity to this story. The aftermath of the K-19 disaster was shrouded in secrecy, as was everything in the Soviet Union. The surviving crew members were sworn to silence. The 8 men who died in the reactor compartment were buried in closed ceremonies. Their families were told only that they died in the line of duty. The submarine itself was repaired and returned to service, a ghost ship haunted by the memories of its crew. It would go on to have a long, troubled career, suffering several more accidents before finally being decommissioned in 1990. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, as the Cold War thawed, survivors began to speak. Captain Zatayev, in particular, became a vocal advocate for nuclear safety and for recognizing the sacrifices of his men. He wrote memoirs. He gave interviews. He fought for pensions and medical care for the radiation victims. His efforts, along with the gradual declassification of documents, have allowed historians to piece together the true story of that night in July 1961. The historical significance of K-19 is multifaceted. On one level, it is a testament to human courage and sacrifice. The 8 engineers who entered the reactor compartment knew they were walking to their deaths. Yet they did it anyway, to save their comrades and to prevent a catastrophe that could have had global consequences. Their story is one of the most powerful examples of selflessness in military history. On another level, K-19 is a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing technology for political gain. The submarine was not ready. The crew was not fully trained. The safety systems were inadequate. The disaster was, in many ways, preventable. It stands as a stark reminder that when ideology overrides engineering, when deadlines override safety, the cost is measured in human lives. And on a geopolitical level, the incident reveals the fragile, paradoxical nature of the Cold War. 2 superpowers, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, locked in a struggle for dominance. Yet, in moments of extreme crisis, they sometimes chose restraint over escalation. The decision not to exploit K-19's vulnerability may have been one of those moments. A silent acknowledgement that some lines should not be crossed, even in a conflict that knew no boundaries. The fate of the survivors is a story of its own. Many suffered from radiation-related illnesses for the rest of their lives. Cancers, organ failure, chronic pain. The Soviet government was slow to provide adequate medical care or compensation. It was only after the collapse of the USSR that many of them received the recognition and support they deserved. Some, like Captain Zatiev, became symbols of resilience. Others retreated into private life, haunted by the memories of that day. So, what is the final emotional truth of the K-19 story? It is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a complex, layered narrative about the human condition under extreme pressure. It is about the weight of command, the burden of sacrifice, and the thin line between duty and disaster. It is about the choices we make when there are no good options. And it is about the quiet moments of humanity that can flicker, even in the darkest depths of conflict. The reactor on K-19 was stabilized that day in July 1961. But the radiation of that vent continues to echo through history. It reminds us that technology without wisdom is a danger. That courage without compassion is incomplete. And that even in a world divided by ideology, our shared humanity can sometimes be the most powerful force of all. The submarine K-19 is now a museum piece, moored in a Russian naval base. Visitors can walk its narrow corridors, see the cramped bunks, touch the cold metal of the reactor compartment. But the real story is not in the steel. It is in the memories of the men who served on her, in the choices they made, in the silence that followed their sacrifice, and in the question that still lingers, like a ghost in the North Atlantic. What if the Americans had acted differently? What if they had seen an opportunity instead of a tragedy? The fact that we can ask that question, and that the answer is not obvious, is perhaps the most powerful legacy of K-19. It forces us to confront the complexity of history, to understand that the past is not a series of simple lessons, but a tapestry of decisions, accidents, and human moments that continue to shape our present. In the end, the story of K-19 is not just about a submarine. It is about us, about the choices we face when the stakes are highest, about the courage to do what is right, even when it costs everything, and about the hope that, even in our darkest hours, we can find a way to choose humanity over hatred. That is the story worth telling. That is the story worth remembering. And that is why, 60 years later, the tale of K-19 still matters. Not as a relic of a forgotten conflict, but as a mirror held up to our own time. A reminder that the decisions we make today, in the face of crisis, will echo in the hearts and minds of those who come after us. So let us choose wisely. Let us choose courage. And let us never forget the 87 men who, in the deep cold of the North Atlantic, faced the abyss and chose to save each other.